able you are to protect individual citizens who are innocent from the blackmailing and from the kind of terror that warlords tend to impose upon them, so that they are better able to entrench themselves and establish a grab of hold on power through the grabbing of things like resources or perhaps taking refugee camps hostage. It is important, Madam Speaker, to remember that warlords are not just organized, they are also well armed. And citizens do not have a means of protection against these individuals, so you do need to get there faster. The last benefit is that the quicker you can stabilize that situation within a country, the quicker you're also able to stabilize the region in itself. Because what this side of the House ignores in today's debate is that most conflicts are at the very least regional in nature as well. There are spillover effects that will transfer from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in fact, there is an accusation that that entire problem stems from the conflicts within Rwanda as well. So at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, how exactly does the policy provide better response time? First of all, talk to you about the idea of how there are more soldiers, we're more able to do this. But what I would suggest is that it also cuts away one layer of the bureaucracy and politicking that exists within the United Nations ability. And we say that you would make them less paralyzed to act when they need to act. We don't rely on the magnanimity of nation states to save lives. Because if you think about it, they're asking the United Nations to always wait for somebody to say, yes, we will give you soldiers because we deem that this conflict deserves some help. What this does show you, Madam Speaker, is that in the status quo, the only conflicts that will actually get the help are conflicts that are based on self-interest or will affect the self-interest of nation states who feel that they can donate some things or some people to these things. They won't necessarily make the sacrifice of soldiers because they do not want their own blood to be spilled, but they'll be perfectly willing to get the money. That's precisely why we have the technology to help. Moreover, Madam Speaker, we say that given this kind of context, response time therefore is important, and we say that opening government will provide you with that. Yes.
The response time is currently slow because the Security Council sits and deliberates in countries' block votes. That's something that happens under your policy as
well. That's fine. But our other argument wasn't simply the whole negotiation of whether or not you're going to go in. Because once the Security Council does decide that you can go in, Madam Speaker, you also have to have the capability to do so. And if you don't have soldiers and nobody donates anything or anyone to that cause, then you won't be able to do anything anyway. The most you can do is issue a useless condemnation of genocide in Darfur. The second thing I want to discuss is what better allows the conflict to be better neutralized. Because their contention was that there is no added value. And this is precisely where I'm going to talk to you about the idea. Well, they discussed the idea of the profit motive. I want to talk about dispositions. Because the difference between the disposition ingrained in soldiers and in people who have been raised to be private military contractors is huge. And it's important to take a note of that because it dictates their first instinct once something wrong occurs. It dictates, Madam Speaker, how they will react when a gunshot is fired. A soldier, Madam Speaker, will tend to be on attack mode because that is how they have been trained. Whereas, Madam Speaker, there is a certain form of professionalism because people from private military companies do tend to think of this as a business. They aren't as nationalistic as these individuals. They don't respond to nationalistic fervor. And we say that the benefit to this is not only do you save citizens' lives, you're also better able to save soldiers' lives, which is also important. It might actually be a detriment, Madam Speaker, for these individuals to come from nation states. We say that they're also less capable or likely to hold soldiers accountable. These people or peacekeepers that come from nation states in the past, especially in the African region, have pillaged and have raped before. And when you compare how there are completely untransparent court-martial mechanisms within nation states versus military tribunals that can occur in the international community with international scrutiny and international spotlight, we say that you're better able to take a look at how these people act. The UN, Madam Speaker, is also less likely to hold donated soldiers accountable because first they need to get over questions of sovereignty, which is ridiculous because this behavior has to be condoned as a result of a defensive mechanism. But secondly, because they're held hostage by nation states who donate, they don't want to alienate the country who donates because that compromises that country's ability and willingness to donate in the future. In that case, Madam Speaker, that doesn't occur with PMCs because as Steve has already said, there are many of them. The last thing I want to argue, very briefly, is the idea of pullouts. We don't want to start wars that we can't finish. And the emotional resonance of losing a soldier is a lot greater than the resonance of losing a private military contractor. And if that's the case, Madam Speaker, we say that we would rather that domestic politics play as little a role as possible in the wars that we need to win. And for these reasons and more, we think that opening government has already won this debate.
We change it every time they send if we need a opposition.
Madam Speaker, you know how insensitive side proposition is to the problem at the ground when they say that we are fine with the loss of a life of a private military contractor as opposed to that of the national army. We think that's extremely insensitive. Each one of them is a life, and we think that's why they should realize that their policy is so extremely flawed. I'm going to talk to you about three things. Firstly, I'm going to examine in greater detail this idea of the loss of accountability and the harms that arise due to that. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how this dilutes the role of developing nations in the United Nations. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about how this is shirking the shirking responsibilities by the developed nations. But before that, let's address a few rebuttals. The first idea is that on internal conflict versus war. Because what Jayesh was suggesting was not that there's a lack of conflict, was that there's a lack of inter-country wars when countries are likely to go ahead and engage in wars with each other. We don't think that's very likely to happen, Madam Speaker, which is what they need to prove. So given that that's not likely to happen, that means that countries have a lot of spare capacity in terms of the number of troops they can send as peacekeepers to these internal conflicts. We do concede to the fact that there are lots of internal conflicts and civil strife happening in the world today, and we think on the first level they haven't shown us the need to go and actually spend so much money when there are so many troops lying in the first place. But on the second level, they examine this idea of response time and supposedly how response time is improved under their paradigm. Firstly, we tell you that response time is high because the UN takes so much time to deliberate. We think that the pool of soldiers is something the UN is already aware of. They're already made aware of how many soldiers are there who are ready to go into war, into their peacekeeping mission immediately. But it's bureaucracy that takes time to decide. We think that's likely to be exacerbated on their scenario, where you have a tendering and bidding process where companies have to go on bid, Madam Speaker. And furthermore, if a company thinks that the bidding process is unfair, they're likely to sue the UN, and then that's likely to go on for endlessly, Madam Speaker. There's likely to be a greater processing time under their paradigm. We think furthermore that if the UN feels that the lowest bid is extremely high, then they're likely to deliberate even further as to whether they should go for a private military contractor or whether they should go for nation states. We think that the bureaucracy is likely to be more under their paradigm. So we think that's absolute rubbish.
Pointer.
No, please sit down. Then let's look at the third idea. Because they never really examined with our principle of the idea of stakeholdership of nation states. We told you how extremely important it is, Madam Speaker. But since they didn't engage with us on the principle, let's examine the practical consequences that arise as a result of that stakeholdership, or rather the absence of that stakeholdership, Madam Speaker. We tell you at the end of the day that given the fact that these military contractors don't have any sense of accountability, that they aren't fighting for a flag, Madam Speaker, that they are only fighting for money, what that means is that they're clearly working on a risk-reward basis, Madam Speaker. As they themselves said, they're working purely as a business organization, which means they're because they're clearly making a risk calculus here, right, in their minds, which means that the moment that they go into the war or go into this conflict zone and find that the peacekeeping process is leading to a lot of loss of lives, they're going to chicken out and say, you know what, we don't want to do this anymore, we leave. What's the worst that can happen to them? They've signed a civil contract, Madam Speaker, saying that, you know what, we'll engage in this war. At worst, all they'll do is to pay fines, Madam Speaker. We don't think that's nothing more, and we don't think that's something they're only reluctant to do because that really is a huge loss to them in this case. We don't think that's likely to happen in the case of nations because there's a greater thing, their reputation is at stake, Madam Speaker. The fact that they are geopolitically involved with so many countries, the fact that they're accountable to other member nations within the United Nations, Madam Speaker. When we tell you furthermore, it's because of this lack of accountability that they're less likely to engage in some of the more humane aspects of peacekeeping that Jayesh talked about, that she completely failed to rebut. You lost a chance, sit down, and I'm kidding.
You guys are a bit like the UN. You're saying, well, it's really nice, you have this accountability, we have this pride, all that stuff. The UN has failed in Darfur, in Congo, in Rwanda. How much more do you want to fail?